I've never liked Jax. I've always considered him a disruption to the very fabric of what I've worked for. Culinary school is a place for the best to sharpen their skills, but to me, Jax is a walking contradiction. He's brash, cocky, and takes risks that make no sense. I'm here to master technique, perfect every dish, and eventually take my place in the world's most prestigious kitchens. Jax, he's here to break the rules, fly by the seat of his pants, and somehow get away with it. I suppose I should start with the basics. My name is Ethan, and I'm going to win this competition. The National Culinary Championship is everything. It's the culmination of years of training, sweat, and sacrifice. I've spent more time in kitchens than I care to admit, learning the art of perfect timing, the balance of flavors, the precision required to elevate simple dishes to a level of brilliance. The instructors at this school know me. They respect my work ethic. They see me as the one to beat. And that's where Jax comes in, my greatest rival. He's been at this school for only a year, but it's like he owns the place. He has a way of walking into a room that demands attention, even when he's done nothing to deserve it. He's a whirlwind of energy, loud, unpredictable, and always the center of every conversation. His knives are always a bit too sharp, his pan's always a bit too hot. I don't know how he does it, but somehow, everything he touches turns to gold. It's maddening. And worse, he has this smile. This arrogant, cocky smile that makes me feel like I'm wasting my time. Our rivalry started in the first few weeks of class. We were assigned to work together on a team project, and from the moment we laid eyes on each other, it was clear this wouldn't be an easy partnership. He teased me for my over-the-top attention to detail, mocked the way I meticulously planned every step of our dish. "You know, you're supposed to actually cook, not just follow a blueprint," he said, tossing the recipe aside like it was a suggestion, not a guide. I'd spent days perfecting our dish, a seared duck breast with a raspberry reduction. But when Jax arrived late to class, wearing his usual grin and a jacket that looked like it had never seen a starch, I knew we were headed for disaster. He immediately took control, ignoring my careful instructions and throwing his own wild spin on the recipe. "Let's make it better, Ethan. I promise it'll be better," he said, his eyes glinting with that infuriating confidence of his. We ended up making a disaster of the dish, and when the judges came to taste it, I couldn't help but feel the heat in my cheeks as they looked between us. Jax's bravado, his charm, and the confidence he carried had somehow won them over. They loved it. I hated him for it. He looked at me, his lips curving in that infuriating grin of his, and I could tell he knew exactly what was going through my head. That night, I spent hours in my tiny apartment, obsessing over the failure. I was used to being the best, so why couldn't I just out-cook him? I knew it wasn't about technique. It was about something more, something deeper. Jax wasn't just playing a game of cooking. He was playing a game with people, with emotions, with the very idea of control. Felt like he was out to prove something, like he wanted to break me. But nothing could break me, not unless I allowed it. I had a plan to crush him. I would show him that cooking was more than just showmanship. I would win and he would fall behind. I just had to stay focused. I kept my distance from Jax for the next few weeks. Every time we crossed paths in the kitchen, the air crackled between us. He'd give me that look. Half a challenge, half a dare, and I'd push it down, refocus. He wanted to get under my skin, I knew that, but I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. Then came the team-building event. It was supposed to be a simple social night, a break from the intense pressure of the competition. Our instructors thought it would help us build camaraderie, let us unwind and get to know each other outside of the kitchen. They didn't realize what they were asking. Me and Jax, alone in a room together, after weeks of simmering tension? I didn't want to go, but I had no choice. When the notice went up on the bulletin board, I read it over with a sinking feeling. Everyone had to attend and everyone had to mingle. That meant being in close proximity to Jax, and that meant being in a place I didn't want to be. Started off just as I imagined. I stood at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of wine and keeping to myself. The chatter around me seemed to fade away as I tried to tune out the noise, focus on the people I actually knew. Jax was doing his usual thing, joking around with a group of students, throwing his head back in laughter, looking like he belonged in the spotlight. His presence was magnetic, even if I didn't want to admit it. I could feel the pull from across the room. It wasn't long before Jax noticed me standing there, and of course, he couldn't leave me alone. He made his way over, his casual stride confident, bordering on cocky. "Ethan, you're looking awfully lonely," he said, the grin on his face widening. "Don't tell me you're afraid of a little fun?" I didn't reply right away. I just stared at him, the familiar irritation bubbling inside me. I wanted to retort, tell him I didn't need to stoop to his level to have a good time. But he was already standing too close, and that smile was too much. My heart started to race, and I quickly looked away, taking another sip of my wine to steady my nerves. "You really need to loosen up," he said, his voice dropping to something more teasing, more dangerous. "It's just a party, Ethan. You don't have to be so serious all the time." The fact that he'd noticed, that he'd zeroed in on me like that, made my pulse spike. I hated that he had this effect on me. I hated that he was so easy, so comfortable in this kind of atmosphere, while I was trapped in my own head. It was frustrating. I didn't want to spend the night in a social setting with him, but somehow the conversation kept going. Felt like we were playing a game, and neither of us knew the rules. Each sentence he threw my way was a challenge, and I couldn't help but take the bait, even though I knew I shouldn't. The more he pushed, the more my discomfort grew. But at the same time, something else was stirring inside me, a feeling I wasn't ready to confront. Eventually, we found ourselves near the bar, standing in awkward silence for a moment. The room was loud, the music pulsing, but it felt like it was just the two of us. Jax's eyes were fixed on me, like he was waiting for me to say something, anything. I could feel the pressure building, and for a moment, I almost wished I could just disappear. "I didn't come here to babysit you, Ethan," Jax said finally, his voice softer now, almost teasing. "But I'll make an exception. You need to loosen up." It was like he was daring me, and before I could stop myself, I found my hand reaching for the glass in front of me, tossing the rest of it back. "Maybe you should just go find someone else to entertain," I said, my words a bit more biting than I intended. But Jax wasn't deterred. Instead, he leaned in just a little closer. I could feel the heat of his body against mine, a feeling I didn't know how to handle. My heart skipped a beat, but I forced myself to look away, forcing my gaze to the floor, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened. "Well, it's a good thing I'm already entertained," he said, his voice low and amused. And then, without another word, he stepped back, leaving me standing there, feeling more than a little rattled. I hadn't expected to feel this way, but there it was. Confusion, and a rush of guilt, a sudden, undeniable attraction I couldn't deny. As the night wore on, I tried to push it out of my mind, but I knew it was too late. Something had shifted between us, something I wasn't ready to deal with, something that wasn't just about cucking or competition. I didn't know what it was, but I had a feeling I was going to find out sooner than I liked. And I was right. I thought I could avoid him after the event, but I was wrong. It's like Jax had some sixth sense, some uncanny ability to track me down, even in the busiest corners of the school. Everywhere I turned, there he was, sliding into the space next to me with that annoyingly charming grin, the one that always made my stomach do an irritating flip. The days following that night were a blur of chaos. Every time I caught myself thinking about what happened, about us, whatever that even meant, I felt the heat creep up my neck. My reaction, the way my heart had pounded, the way I had almost let him kiss me, it all haunted me. But I couldn't let it distract me. I had a plan. I had that goal. Nothing, not even Jax, was going to derail me from the competition. I buried myself in my work, focusing on perfecting every dish, pushing the memory of that night further and further away. But the thing about Jax was that he was relentless. It didn't matter that I kept my head down. It didn't matter that I gave him icy glares when we passed each other in the hallway. Jax wasn't the kind of person to let things go. He saw me as a challenge, and I hated how right he was. Started off small, little things, nothing too noticeable at first. I'd be working on a dish, carefully balancing the flavors, making sure every part was perfect. and then Jax would appear, leaning over my shoulder. His presence was always unnerving, like a storm on the horizon, a threat you couldn't quite shake. "Still playing it safe, huh?" he'd say, his voice dripping with that teasing edge of his. "You know, the real competition is going to be wild. You're going to have to do better than that if you want to stand out." His breath was always warm against my skin, and I hated how I could feel it even before I saw him. I hated how his words, while infuriating, had a way of creeping under my skin, making me second-guess myself. "I don't need you to remind me what the competition's like," I said, my voice tight with irritation, but he wasn't bothered. He never was. Jax just grinned, that damn smile of his spreading across his face like he'd just gotten away with something. He leaned even closer, his eyes glinting with mischief. "You know, you're not as uptight as you think you are," he said casually, like it was just a simple observation, but it felt like a jab, like he was trying to get under my skin. "Again, you're just scared to take risks. But then again, you've always been about playing it safe, haven't you, Ethan?" That was when I noticed it. The way his words made my pulse spike, like a challenge I couldn't resist. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. That damn grin of his. "I'm not scared," I said, my words firmer than I felt. I wanted him to know that I wasn't afraid of anything. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder if he was right. "You'll see," he said softly, his voice dropping just enough that I had to lean in slightly to hear him. "You're better than this. You just have to stop being so afraid of messing up." The way he said it made me uneasy, like he knew something I didn't. It wasn't just about cooking anymore. It wasn't about the competition or our rivalry. I was afraid of something else, something I couldn't name, something that had nothing to do with food or timing. I turned back to my dish, trying to focus on the layers of flavors I was balancing, the textures I was perfecting. But Jax's words stayed with me. I hated that they did. The next day, we were paired up for another project. I'm not sure who decided it, but it didn't matter. There we were, stuck with each other again. The tension between us was unbearable, like an unspoken rule that we were supposed to stay away from each other, but couldn't. My annoyance with him seemed to bounce off him, like he didn't care. He barely glanced at me during the briefing and immediately jumped into organizing the project. Of course, he took charge, deciding what we'd do and how we'd do it, like I wasn't even there. "We're going to try something different this time," he said, tossing me a box of ingredients, his voice all business. But there was something in his eyes, something playful. "Trust me, Ethan. I'll make it work. You just follow my lead." "I'll make it work," I said, my voice tight, my irritation rising. I hated how easily he took control, how effortlessly he acted like the boss, as if I wasn't standing there, just as capable, just as skilled. But we worked through it. We always did, despite how much I resented it. Every time Jax took control, it irked me more. Yet, every time we worked together, there was something undeniable between us. Something in the way he spoke, the way he moved, the way his energy filled up the space around us. As the hours went by, the competition heated up. The kitchen was a blur of noise and movement, but Jax always had a way of keeping things light, making jokes or offering me an unexpected compliment that left me flustered. And then there were those moments where our hands brushed, where I felt his breath on my neck, where he'd lean a little too close, just enough to make me feel his presence. I hated how much I noticed it. I hated how much I felt my pulse quicken when his fingers grazed mine. And when I glanced over at him, catching his eyes on me, I felt a flicker of something that made my stomach twist in an uncomfortable way. I knew it wasn't just competition anymore. It was something else, something confusing, something I didn't know how to handle. By the end of the day, we'd made it through the project without killing each other, which I considered a victory in itself. But as the kitchen emptied out and we gathered our things, the silence between us was thick, heavy. I could feel the words hanging between us, unspoken. Neither of us knew how to deal with what had happened, with the way we both had slipped into something more than rivalry, more than professional distance. It was then that I heard his voice, low and steady, cutting through the silence. "You know, I thought you'd be the type to always play by the rules," Jack said, his back to me as he packed up his station. But I'm starting to think I was wrong. I froze. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'm not playing games, I said, trying to sound unaffected. But there was a tremor in my voice that betrayed me. Jax turned to face me then, his eyes sharp, his lips curling into that mischievous smile. You're playing a game, Ethan. You just don't know the rules yet. Before I could respond, before I could tell him that he was wrong, he stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. Smell the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the spices in the air. It was too much. It was too close. I'll see you tomorrow, Ethan, he said. His voice soft but layered with something else, something I couldn't place. And then he was gone. I stood there, frozen for a moment, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. His words haunted me as I cleaned up my station, the tension lingering in the air long after he had left. The next day, I couldn't avoid him any longer. Every time we crossed paths, every time he looked at me with that look, I felt my control slipping. He was getting under my skin in ways I didn't know how to fight. I knew, deep down, that this rivalry between us was no longer about competition or culinary skills. It had become something else, something dangerous, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that it didn't matter. It's strange how one moment can change everything. I thought I was prepared for the intensity of the competition. After all, this was the culmination of everything I'd worked for. But nothing had prepared me for how Jax's presence would gnaw at me every day, even when we weren't working together. Every time I saw him, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to hate him, to distance myself from him completely, but another part, a dangerous part, wanted to lean in closer, wanted to see what happened if I stopped resisting. I was standing at my station one afternoon, my knife moving methodically through the delicate layers of onions, when I felt it again, the weight of his gaze. I didn't need to look up to know he was watching me. I could feel the pull of his attention from across the room, like a magnet. The kitchen felt charged, the air too thick, too heavy. I tried to ignore it, to push the feeling away, but it was impossible. There was no escape from him. No matter how hard I tried to focus, my thoughts kept slipping back to him. His laugh, his voice, his touch, and God, that smile. Ik hoondig me. You're thinking too hard, Ethan. Jax's voice came from behind me and I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want him near me, but somehow he always ended up right where I didn't want him to be. I turned slightly, just enough to see him leaning against the counter, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in his eyes, something that made my pulse quicken. I opened my mouth, ready to snap at him, to tell him to leave me alone, but the words caught in my throat. It wasn't just frustration that I was feeling now. It was something else, something I didn't want to admit. I'm fine, I said, the words coming out more sharply than I intended. But Jax didn't seem fazed. Of course, he wouldn't be. He never was. Are you sure? You're getting a little too intense over that dish. His tone was teasing, like he was mocking me. But there was an underlying sincerity there that I couldn't ignore. I just want to get it right, I muttered, unable to help myself. I wanted to push him away, to shut him out, but his proximity was making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Yeah, I get it. You've always been about getting it perfect. Jax's voice softened, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Something that didn't belong with the usual cocky attitude he wore like armor. But you're not going to get it perfect if you don't let go a little, Ethan. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling slightly as I focused on my work, desperately trying to ignore the way his words seemed to sink in, like they were meant for me, personally, like he knew exactly how to get under my skin. Maybe you should try it sometime, I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. I didn't even look at him as I spoke, my focus still on the onions, but I could feel the heat in my cheeks. Damn him. Damn his ability to make me feel like I was losing control. Jax didn't say anything at first. The silence stretched out, and I could feel his eyes on me, like he was waiting for me to break. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he let out a quiet chuckle. You really don't get it, do you? He said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. But I heard every word. You're not perfect, Ethan. And neither am I. But maybe that's the point. I didn't respond. Couldn't. There was too much in what he said. Too much truth buried beneath his words. I was so focused on being perfect, on being better than him, that I'd missed the point entirely. And I hated him for it. Hated that he was right. Jack stayed for a moment longer, just watching me, his presence a heavy weight in the air. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. And for a second, I felt like I could breathe again. Until I realized that I was still thinking about him. His words, his presence. Couldn't shake it. The days that followed were a blur. The competition was looming closer, and the pressure was starting to crack me open. I had to be perfect. I had to win. But no matter how hard I tried to stay focused, Jax was always there, slipping into my thoughts at the most inconvenient times. We were paired together again, just as we had been before. And this time I was determined to keep my distance. No distractions. No weakness. We were given a simple assignment. Make a dish that highlighted seasonal ingredients, something fresh and unique. It should have been easy, but for some reason, it felt like everything I did was under scrutiny. And Jax wasn't helping. He kept hovering around my station, offering unsolicited advice and making comments about my technique, about my timing. "You're taking too long on that," he said, leaning over my shoulder. His breath was warm against my skin again, and it made me feel jittery, unsettled. "You've got to move faster if you want to win." "I'm not in a hurry," I said. My voice clipped, as I tried to keep my focus on the dish I was preparing. "And I'm not taking advice from you." "Oh, I didn't know you were too good for my advice." Jax's voice was teasing, but there was something underneath it that made me clench my jaw. "You've got a lot of pride, Ethan. It's kind of impressive, actually." "Pride isn't the problem," I muttered, my hands working more quickly now, trying to ignore him. "The problem is you." "Is it?" he asked, his voice suddenly too quiet. I could feel his eyes on me, and for the first time, it felt like he was serious. "I think the problem is you won't let anyone get close enough to help." I froze, my heart slamming in my chest. His words hit me like a punch. It wasn't just the competition anymore. It wasn't just about cooking. He was talking about something else, something deeper, something I didn't want to confront. "I don't need help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to push him away, but my own words felt empty. Jax didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching me, as if waiting for me to crack. And for a moment I felt like I might. It was all too much, the tension between us, the competition, the overwhelming pressure. But I couldn't let him see it. Not again. He stepped back, just enough to give me space, but I could still feel his presence lingering, like a shadow at the edge of my vision. "I never said you weren't good enough, Ethan," he said quietly. "I just think you're too afraid to let anyone in." The words lingered in the air long after he'd walked away. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know what to do with him. Later that night, I found myself alone in the kitchen again, the soft hum of the lights above filling the silence. I was supposed to be working, but my mind kept drifting back to what Jax had said. Was he right? Was I really that afraid? I thought I had everything under control, but it was all starting to unravel. I didn't want to admit it, but the truth was staring me in the face. The truth was that every time I saw Jax, I felt something. Something I couldn't name. Something I didn't know how to control. And it terrified me. I couldn't let myself get distracted by him. Not now. But no matter how hard I tried to push him away, no matter how hard I focused on my work, I couldn't seem to escape him. The next day, I walked into the kitchen with a plan. A plan to keep my distance, to focus only on the competition. But when I saw Jax across the room, his eyes locking onto mine with that familiar, infuriating intensity, I felt the walls I had so carefully constructed start to crack. I wasn't ready for what was coming next, but it was already too late. The days that followed felt like an endless loop. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked to push Jax from my thoughts, he was always there. His words, his gaze, his presence. It was like an invisible thread connecting us, pulling me closer every time I tried to pull away. I couldn't escape it, couldn't escape him. I should have known better than to believe I could just go back to the way things were. There was no going back now. Whatever had happened between us was too complicated to ignore, too tangled to unravel. And it was only getting worse. We were nearing the final stretch of the competition, and the tension in the kitchen was palpable. Every station was a battleground, each of us fighting for a chance at victory. And yet, every time I glanced across the room, there he was, Jax, working with an intensity that mirrored my own. But it wasn't just the competition anymore. Every time I looked at him, every time I saw that self-assured smirk of his, I felt something inside me stir. It was a feeling I couldn't quite name, something between frustration and longing, something that made my heart race and my chest tighten. But it wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. Every moment I spent in his orbit, I could feel my control slipping, and I hated that. I hated how easily he seemed to get under my skin, how effortlessly he seemed to dismantle my defenses. I was in the middle of prepping for the next round when he approached me again. I didn't even have to look up to know it was him. The air around me shifted, charged with his presence. I could feel him standing just behind me, close enough that I could hear his breath, his footsteps, his every movement. I forced myself to focus, to ignore him, but I couldn't. "You look like you're about to snap." Jax's voice came, low and teasing, like he was enjoying every second of it. I didn't respond at first. I just kept chopping the vegetables in front of me, my hands moving quickly, trying to maintain the illusion of control. "You know, if you keep this up, you're going to burn out before the final round," he continued, his tone soft but pointed. "And I wouldn't want to see that happen." "I'm fine," I muttered, not looking up, my voice tight with the effort of not losing my cool. "I've got this under control." Jax's chuckle was soft, almost intimate, and it made my skin prickle. "You're always so defensive, Ethan. You know, it's okay to admit that you're struggling." "I'm not struggling," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. There was a beat of silence, and for a moment, I thought maybe he'd leave me alone. But of course, he didn't. "I know you're not the type to ask for help," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter, something that almost sounded like understanding. "But sometimes, it's better to lean on someone than to try and do it all alone." I froze. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I wanted to brush them off, to tell him that I didn't need help, that I wasn't weak. But the truth was, I was tired. Tired of pretending I had it all figured out. Tired of pretending I didn't feel the weight of the competition, the pressure building inside me. But I couldn't let him see that. Couldn't let him in. "I'm fine," I said again, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Just get back to your own station, Jax." There was a pause, a long one, and I could feel his gaze on me, penetrating, studying. I didn't look up, didn't dare to, but I knew he was still there, still watching. And I knew, deep down, that he wasn't going to let me hide from him forever. The rest of the day passed in a blur, but every moment felt like a battle. Every glance Jax threw my way seemed to carry more weight than the last. His presence was suffocating, like a fog that I couldn't shake, no matter how hard I tried. By the time the final round arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. The kitchen was filled with the sounds of frantic chopping, sizzling pans, and the occasional muttered curse. The pressure was unbearable. I could feel Jax's eyes on me as I worked, his gaze never straying far from my station. It was like he was trying to get into my head, to make me second-guess every decision I made. I tried to block him out, tried to focus on my dish, but it was hard. He was too close. His energy, his intensity, it was like a magnet, pulling me in no matter how hard I tried to fight it. Every time I looked up, there he was, his eyes locked onto mine, as if daring me to break. And every time, it took everything I had not to. But it wasn't just the competition. It wasn't just about food. There was something more going on, something that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Every word he said, every look he gave me, felt like an invitation, a challenge. And no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I couldn't help but feel it. This pull, this tension between us that was impossible to escape. The final challenge came down to plating. It was all about presentation, all about showing off everything we had learned over the course of the competition. I worked in silence, my hands moving with precision as I carefully arranged the components of my dish. The tension in the air was thick, like everyone knew this was the moment that would decide everything. And then, in the middle of it all, I felt it again. That familiar presence hovering just behind me, just close enough that I could feel the heat of his body against my back. I didn't have to look to know it was Jax. "You're taking forever," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the noise of the kitchen like a knife. "You're overthinking it again. You just have to trust yourself." I wanted to tell him to leave me alone, to tell him to stop watching me, to stop getting under my skin. But something in his voice, something in the way he said it, made me pause. "Trust myself," I repeated, my voice quiet, unsure. What does that even mean? Jax didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned in closer, so close I could feel his breath against my ear. "It means you need to stop pretending you're in control of everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not perfect, Ethan, and that's okay." I stiffened at his words, but he wasn't finished. "Stop trying to do everything alone," he added, his tone soft but insistent. "Let someone in for once." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. My heart was racing, my hands trembling. I wanted to push him away, but I couldn't. I couldn't make myself move. I didn't know what to say, what to feel. All I could do was stand there, frozen in the moment. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, Jack stepped back, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned away. The moment was gone, just like that, leaving me with nothing but the pounding of my heart and the weight of his words. I didn't know what he meant by that. I didn't know why he kept pushing, why he kept trying to break down my walls. But one thing was clear: he wasn't going to stop. And neither was I. I finished plating my dish, but the entire time, my thoughts were a whirlwind, my mind racing with everything Jax had said. I was at a breaking point. The competition was almost over, and I couldn't deny it anymore. Jax had gotten inside my head, and whether I liked it or not, I was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I wanted him there. But the question was, what was I willing to do about it? The days were getting shorter as the competition neared its final moments, and the weight of it all pressed heavier on my chest with each passing minute. The kitchen had become a battleground, a high-stakes arena where every action mattered. It was no longer just about cooking. It was about survival, my reputation, my future, my pride. And through all the pressure, there was Jax. His presence never wavered, constantly pulling at the strings of my resolve, testing my limits. I tried to ignore him, tried to focus only on the task at hand, but it was becoming impossible. Every time I glanced up, there he was, his eyes locking onto mine with that knowing, irritating smile that had become all too familiar. I couldn't escape it, couldn't escape him. He wasn't just my rival anymore. He had become something else, something dangerous. He was in my thoughts constantly, and I hated how easily he seemed to slip into my head. There was a rawness to it now, an intensity one couldn't shake. It felt like I was being pulled into a storm, a current too strong to fight against. Every time we crossed paths, the world seemed to shrink, and all I could focus on was him. It was maddening. It all came to a head one night, just a few days before the final round. The kitchen was empty, save for the faint clinking of pans and the soft hum of the overhead lights. I was alone, finishing up some last-minute prep when I heard the door creak open. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The air shifted with his presence, thickening in a way I couldn't explain. "Jax." I forced myself to keep working, to act like I wasn't affected. But it was impossible. I could feel him watching me, could sense the tension growing between us like an electric charge in the air. He was just standing there, not saying anything, but his gaze was like a physical touch, sliding over me, making my skin prickle with awareness. "You always work late," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was soft, casual, but there was something underneath it, a weight, a heaviness I couldn't place. "I have a lot to do," I muttered, focusing on my knife, slicing through the vegetables with mechanical precision. I didn't want to look at him. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much he affected me. But every word he spoke seemed to wrap itself around me, pulling me closer. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," Jack said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. I stiffened, my heart skipping a beat. He was too close now. I could feel the heat of his body behind me, the warmth radiating off him like a furnace. I wanted to push him away to create distance, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the pull of his presence. "I don't need help," I said, my voice tight, defensive. I didn't want to let him in. Not now, not ever. But I could feel the cracks in my resolve starting to form. "You don't have to need it to accept it," he replied, his words slow, deliberate. "You're not invincible, Ethan. No one is. And you can't keep pushing people away like this." I exhaled sharply, trying to ignore the way my chest tightened at his words. I didn't want to hear this. I didn't want to feel vulnerable. I didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, he was right. That maybe I had been shutting everyone out, him included. "I'm fine," I muttered again. But this time it didn't sound as convincing. I didn't believe it, and neither did he. "Are you?" His voice was softer now, almost teasing, like he could see through my defenses. "You've been on edge all week. Every time I look at you, it's like you're about to snap. And I'm starting to think it's because you don't know how to handle all of this anymore." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to yell at him, to tell him to leave me alone, but something inside me stopped me. I couldn't do it. Not when his words were ringing in my ears. Not when there was a truth to them that I couldn't ignore. I turned slowly to face him, finally meeting his gaze. His eyes were intense, but there was something else there now, something softer. Something that made my pulse quicken and my stomach flip. It wasn't just the rivalry anymore. It wasn't just the competition. There was something real between us. Something I couldn't deny. I'm not invincible, Jax," I whispered, my voice cracking slightly. It felt like the walls I had built around myself were crumbling, piece by piece. "But I can't." Before I could finish, Jack stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch my arm. His fingers were warm against my skin, sending a jolt of electricity through me. I flinched, but I didn't pull away. For some reason, I didn't want to. "You don't have to do this alone," he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost soothing. There was a vulnerability in his words that I hadn't expected. Took me off guard, left me unsure of how to respond. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came. My throat felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what to do with this unexpected softness, this rawness between us. It was too much. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready for him. "You're scared," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if he could read my thoughts. "And that's okay, but you don't have to be." I swallowed hard, my chest tight, my thoughts a jumbled mess. He was so close now. I could feel his breath against my cheek, could feel the heat of his body seeping into mine. I wanted to push him away, to tell him to stop, but I didn't. I didn't want him to stop. And then, just as quickly as he had stepped forward, Jax withdrew. He pulled back, taking his hand away from my arm, and for a moment, I was left standing there, frozen, staring at the empty space between us. "Take a break, Ethan," he said softly, as if nothing had happened. "You're burning out. I don't want to see you fall apart." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. I was too stunned, too shaken by the weight of the moment. And before I could find the words, Jax was already walking away, disappearing into the darkness of the kitchen. I stood there for a long time, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. My heart was still pounding, my thoughts racing. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know what it meant. But one thing was clear. Something had shifted between us. Something had changed, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. The next day, everything felt different. The air in the kitchen was thick with tension. But this time, it wasn't just the competition weighing on me. It was Jack's. His presence lingered in the back of my mind, making everything else feel distant, unimportant. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before, the way his hand had felt on my arm, the way his words had sunk into me, leaving a mark I couldn't erase. I tried to focus on my work, tried to push everything else aside, but it was impossible. Every time I glanced up, I saw him, and every time my heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what I wanted. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront this, whatever it was, between us. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep pretending like nothing was happening. I couldn't keep pretending like I wasn't falling for him. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Not anymore. I didn't know how we'd get through this, but I knew one thing. The competition was the least of my worries now. The final round of the competition was fast approaching, and the weight of everything, every decision I had made, every word spoken, pressed down on me harder than I ever imagined it could. The kitchen buzzed with energy, the chefs moving like soldiers in a battlefield, each of us determined to leave our mark. But as much as I tried to focus on the task ahead, my mind kept drifting back to Jack's. The night we shared was still fresh in my memory. The way his touch had sent shockwaves through me, how his words had wrapped themselves around my chest, leaving me breathless. I kept telling myself I needed to focus, that the competition was the only thing that mattered. But how could I when he was there? So close, so impossible to ignore. I had tried to push him away, tried to convince myself that he was just a distraction. But in reality, I was the one distracted. I couldn't get him out of my head, and the more I tried to suppress my feelings, the more they seemed to grow. It was becoming harder to differentiate between my desire to win and my desire for him. I wasn't sure which one mattered more. It was the morning of the final round, and I stood at my station, staring blankly at the ingredients laid out before me. My hands shook slightly as I arranged them, the pressure of the moment weighing heavily on my shoulders. This was it, the last chance to prove myself, to make all the sacrifices worth it. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would matter if I didn't confront what was happening between Jax and me. The truth of it was clear now, undeniable. There was something between us, something that was more than rivalry, more than competition. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't deny it any longer. I heard footsteps behind me, light but purposeful. I knew who it was without looking up. Jax. His presence in the kitchen always seemed to affect the air around me, making everything feel charged. I could feel his eyes on me as I worked, the weight of his gaze pressing down like a physical touch. "Looks like you're in your head again," he said, his voice soft but pointed. I didn't respond. Couldn't. I didn't know what to say. What was there to say? The tension between us was palpable, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jack stood behind me for a moment, his presence a constant reminder of the chaos in my chest. Then, without warning, he stepped closer, his body almost flush against mine. My heart raced as I felt the heat of him so near, his breath warm against my ear. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, a hint of something darker beneath the surface. "Why?" I felt a shiver run through me at the question. I wanted to pull away, wanted to push him out of my space, but something inside me held me there, frozen in place. "I'm not avoiding you," I said, my voice tight. "I'm focused. This is the final round, Jax. I don't have time for anything else." He chuckled softly, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. "Is that really what it is? Or are you scared of what happens if we stop pretending?" I felt my breath catch at his words. He was right. I had been pretending, hadn't I? Pretending that the way I felt about him didn't matter. Pretending that it was all just competition. But now, with his words hanging between us, there was no pretending anymore. I turned to face him, and for a moment, our eyes locked, the weight of everything we hadn't said pressing down on us both. There was no going back now. "You don't get it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I can't afford to lose. I can't afford to let this," I gestured between us, "get in the way." Jax's expression softened, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. "You won't lose. Not because of me. And you don't have to push me away to win." For a moment, I just stared at him, unsure of what to say. His words lingered, settling into my chest like a weight, and I realized that for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was alone in this. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Scared that I'm not good enough. Scared that I'll let everyone down. Scared of this." I gestured between us again, my heart pounding in my chest. I had never been this vulnerable before. I had never let anyone see me this raw, this exposed. But with Jax, it felt like I didn't have a choice. He had already seen all of me. Every crack, every flaw, and yet he was still here. Jax stepped closer, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, his touch sending a wave of warmth through me. "You're enough, Ethan. You always have been. And whatever happens here, it won't change that." His words were a balm to my soul, soothing the anxiety that had been gnawing at me. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to fall. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. "I'm not sure I can do this without you," I said quietly, my voice shaking slightly. It was the truth. The competition, the kitchen, it all felt like too much. But with Jax there, with his support, maybe it wouldn't feel so impossible. "You don't have to do it without me," he replied softly. "But you do need to let go. Let go of the fear. Let go of the need to control everything. Trust yourself." I closed my eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I knew he was right. I couldn't keep holding on to all of this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I was falling apart on the inside. When I opened my eyes, Jax was still there, watching me with a calm intensity. There was no judgment in his gaze, no pressure, just acceptance. "I don't know what comes after this," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "But I know I don't want to keep running from this. From you." Jax's eyes softened, and he gave a small smile. A smile that made my heart ache in ways I wasn't ready to admit. "Then let's face it together." For the rest of the final round, we worked side by side, the tension between us still there. But now it was different. It wasn't something to fight against. It was something to embrace, to accept. We didn't talk much, but there was an understanding between us. Something deeper than words. We were in this together, even if neither of us knew exactly what this was. When the time came to present our dishes, the energy in the room shifted. The other chefs were just as intense, just as focused, but there was a quiet confidence in me now. I wasn't alone in this anymore, and even though I knew the competition wasn't over yet, I felt like I had already won. Not the prize, not the title, but something more important. After the final plating was done and the judges had taken their time to deliberate, we stood in silence, waiting for the results. I could feel the heat of Jax's presence beside me, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to be in control. Whatever happened, I knew I had already made the most important decision of my life. The judges returned, and their words were a blur. But the only thing that mattered in that moment was Jax standing next to me, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet promise. We hadn't won the competition, but we had won something else. And that was enough. As the final moments passed and the crowd dispersed, I turned to Jax, unable to hide the smile tugging at my lips. "We did it," I said, my voice filled with something new. Something I couldn't quite name, but something I was beginning to understand. Jax grinned, his usual cocky demeanor softened by something warmer, something real. "We did," he replied, and in that moment, I realized that the competition had never been the most important thing. What mattered was us, whatever this was between us, whatever it was becoming. We weren't rivals anymore. We weren't enemies. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone. We were something else, and I was ready to see where it would take us.